Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle, which is what you're watching. And I'm your host, Larry Erickson, and hopefully you're watching me too at the moment. And for the next half hour or so, I'm going to be talking about some things that I think are important, worthy of your attention. And if you have any comments, questions, or reactions, whatever to the show, you can always send them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, whoviating at AOL.com. And if you can catch that, you can go to my website. It's called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be over here somewhere a couple of times during the show. You get the email address from there if you didn't get it down, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. The one thing I ask always when you send email is to include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is not spam, it's about the show, and to be a little patient about getting an answer because I just email and me don't get along very well. All right, with that said, let's get on with it. We always like to start where we can with some good news, and I've got some good news this week. First off, it appears that the right wing in North Carolina has really put their foot in at this time. You may recall some of the harsh reactions the state got in the wake of adopting one of the worst of those so-called bathroom bills, the ones that essentially write discrimination against transgender people into law. North Carolina faced reactions including withdrawals of support by some businesses, some canceled concerts, and some threats of boycotts. Well, the good news here is that one of those threats has come to pass. After the state legislature passed a corrected version of the law that actually left its most noxious provisions untouched, the NBA decided to pull the 2017 NBA All-Star Game out of North Carolina. The city of Charlotte, where the game would have been held, estimates this will cost the state's economy about $100 million in lost revenue. Now, I have to admit, I feel bad for the wage earners who are going to be affected by this and impacted by the loss of business. But the fact is, bigotry needs to have a price put on its head. The language of money, the language of business, is perhaps the only one we share with the bigots like North Carolina Governor Pat McCrory and his allies in the legislature, and frankly, their voters among the public. And anything that speaks to that price that bigotry should have to pay is good news. Moving on to another area of really good news, which actually also involves North Carolina. A series of 5 recent court decisions have struck blows against the ongoing attempts by the reactionaries to keep students, minorities, and other people that they think might vote liberal from voting at all. The first blow came on July 19th. Federal District Judge Lynn Edelman ruled that Wisconsin voters would not need a photo ID. If they couldn't get one, they could simply fill out an affidavit swearing to their identity. Now, a federal court had already ruled, higher court had already ruled in favor of the law overall, so Edelman couldn't strike the law down, but he could soften it, which is what he did. And yes, I did talk about this a couple of weeks ago. It bears repeating. The next day, July 20th, the full Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that a voter ID law in Texas discriminates against blacks and Hispanics and ordered that a remedy for this be in place in time for the November election. According to Myrna Perez, an attorney with the Brennan Center for Justice, which tracks issues of voter rights, about 600,000 registered voters in Texas do not have the required identification. Now, interestingly, student IDs you can't use for voter ID, employer IDs you can't use, utility bills, which traditionally have been a means of proving identification and residence, you can't use those. But you know, among the things you can use, a concealed gun permit. The court actually sent the case back to the district court to consider if the law intended to discriminate, but added that regardless of intent, the discriminatory effect, the discriminatory impact was clear enough and in itself sufficient to demand a remedy to this. So we had 2 days and 2 victories for voting rights. And just over a week later, on July 29th, came not a 1-2, but a 1-2-3 punch against the vote blockers. First came North Carolina, where a sweeping decision by a panel of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals struck down that state's voter ID law as clearly unconstitutional, ruling that it consciously, quote, targets African Americans with almost surgical precision, done in an effort to support black voter turnout. It permanently blocked provisions that required certain photo IDs to vote. It blocked provisions that limited early voting. It struck down a provision that eliminated same-day registration. It allowed for out-of-precinct voting, and it put an end to the prohibition against pre-registering young voters. In finding that the state intended to discriminate, the court noted that state lawmakers first sought data breaking down voting preferences by race, and then cut back or eliminated those practices disproportionately used by African Americans, and required forms of ID that black Americans disproportionately lacked. Just hours later, on that same day, Federal District Judge James Peterson struck down a series of voting restrictions in Wisconsin. And this is actually based on a different suit than the one that was ruled on earlier in the month. Peterson wrote that, quoting him, "The Wisconsin experience demonstrates that a preoccupation with mostly phantom election fraud leads to real incidents of disenfranchisement, loss of the right to vote. Wisconsin's strict version of voter ID law is a cure worse than the disease." He ordered the state to make photo IDs more easily available and to broaden the range of student IDs that are acceptable at the polling place, while throwing out other rules, including ones that lengthened the residency requirement for newly registered voters and sharply limited the places and times at which municipal voters, many of them Milwaukee blacks, could cast absentee votes in person. Then later that same day, still July 29th, the light shone on Kansas. Kansas had passed a law saying that you had to produce proof of citizenship in order to register to vote. Now, that is not required by federal law, and so the state tried to create a two-tier voting system so that if you didn't have the proper response to "your papers, please," you could vote in federal elections but not in state or local ones. Some 17,500 Kansas voters were stuck in a legal limbo, a number that was projected to reach as much as 50,000 by Election Day. The ACLU sued on their behalf, saying in the words of agency attorney Sophia Lakin, "You're either registered or you're not. There's no such thing as being half registered." On July 29th, Shawnee County Judge Larry Hendricks agreed, ruling that those voters can have their votes counted in state and local elections as well as federal ones. The ruling went into effect immediately, meaning those voters could have their votes counted in the state's primary, which took place on August 2nd. Now, the injunction is only temporary. It's meant to cover the primary. Judge Hendricks has set a September 21st court date for an evidentiary hearing looking forward to the November elections. But in normal practice, such an injunction would only be issued if the judge in the case felt that that side had a good chance of prevailing in the final decision. In his ruling, Judge Hendricks said that losing one's vote is an irreparable harm. To which I say, damn straight. The thing is, of course, the fanatics are not about to give up, and they will continue to spin their lying lies about hordes of illegal voters flooding our nation's elections with fraudulent votes. 32 states now have some form of voter ID requirement, with 17 states tightening restrictions since 2012. Most of those came in the wake of and took advantage of the fact that in 2013 the Supreme Court essentially ripped the heart out of the Voting Rights Act. And the truth is, of course it's the truth, they're lying, and they know they're lying. They can't not know they are lying. The evidence that voter fraud is almost vanishingly rare in U.S. elections is overwhelming. For example, one example, just 2 years ago, the Washington Post cited what it called in its headline, quoting, 7 papers, 4 government inquiries, 2 news investigations, and 1 court ruling, all of them showing that voter fraud, especially the type of voter impersonation, which is the only kind that photo ID would address, that's mostly a myth. And those studies are by no means the only ones. And other studies have also shown that such laws do actually have an overall impact of depressing turnout among minorities, which of course is the point of them. And now it's gotten so obvious that the courts are starting to recognize it, even if, as in the case of Texas, they're only recognizing the effect, while in places like North Carolina, they're recognizing the intent. Which may be why the argument from the right wing is sort of shifting from it's all about preventing fraud to the right wing's now standard version of accuse the accuser. Just like if you address racism, you'll be faced with some Hannity wannabe escapee from the loony bin going on about how you're the real racist. So now among some of the reactionaries are frothing and moaning about how decisions like these court ones are part of a plot, and I am not joking here and only very slightly exaggerating, they are part of a plot by the Democratic Party to steal the election. North Carolina Governor McCrory, for example, made sure to refer to the members of the Fourth Circuit panel who ruled against him as Democratic judges who are undermining the integrity of our elections. In fact, maybe I'm not exaggerating. After all, two members of the North Carolina legislature, State Senator Phil Berger and House Speaker Tim Moore, said in a joint statement that, and we are quoting here, we can only wonder if the intent, that is the intent of the ruling, we can only wonder if the intent is to reopen the door for voter fraud, potentially allowing fellow Democrat politicians to steal the election. So we still have a long way to go and a lot of fights remain. But the drive to expand restrictive voter ID laws to more states has stalled in recent years, including Pennsylvania, which gave up a court fight of the law. Petition drives in Iowa and Nevada failed, and one in Massachusetts never even got off the ground. So even as the fight continues, the battlefield does not seem to be expanding, which is its own form of good news. And as for those 5 recent court victories for voting rights, they are definitely good news. Oh, by the way, one other thing here. Those primaries in Kansas on August 2nd, in them, a whole string of real right-wing types, along with reactionary Governor Sam Brownback, at least 12 of them, went down to ignoble defeat at the hands of more moderate goppers. Now, that may not mean a whole lot. I mean, what's a moderate Republican in the context of Kansas? But it does mean something and not nothing. And let's take a break. And here we are back. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes. I'm not going to go on a whole long history thing here. But I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes to note 2 anniversaries. August 6th and August 9th are the 71st anniversaries of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The only 2 times, happily, nuclear weapons have actually been set off in war, and 2 of the greatest war crimes in our country's history, if not the world's. And yes, they were war crimes because they were so unnecessary. In the spring and summer of 1945, Japan was already a defeated nation. Its army had been driven back to its own shores. Its navy had been largely destroyed. Its air force was decimated. And even its air defenses had been so beaten down that they couldn't offer an effective response to U.S. air raids, which had already leveled large parts of Tokyo and other major cities. It was so much so that, as is reasonably known, if not widely known, but it's reasonably well known by now, that Japan made overtures to surrender before the bombing of Hiroshima. What is less commonly known is that the U.S. rejected that offer because it was not unconditional, only to accept essentially the same terms for surrender after the bombing of Nagasaki. Now, since the bombings gained so little in terms of the surrender terms, if they advanced the cause so little, it raises the question of why then they were done. And the answer to that is simple as it is chilling. The real target was not Japan. It was the Soviet Union. And the bombings were to show Stalin that we had this enormous power and were ready to use it, so he had better be really, really careful about crossing us in the post-war world. Now, whether or not and to what degree that attempt at intimidation, an attempt carried out in the bodies of scores of thousands of Japanese, to what degree that attempt at intimidation succeeded is not important. What is important is that that was the real reason, the underlying reason, the deep reason why Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed. Many nations, including Germany and Japan, and in more recent times, nations such as El Salvador and Chile, have undertaken conscious efforts to confront and face their own past of violence and militarism, whether those were turned outward against others, as in the case of Germany and Japan, or whether they were turned inward on their own people, as in the case of El Salvador and Chile. But face them they did. And this is another area in which we as Americans lag far behind. And don't expect that to change. Our Nobel Peace Prize president has bombed 7 countries in 7 years: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Libya, and Somalia. He has stretched out our presence in Afghanistan. He's expanding our military footprint in Iraq, and has now initiated what the Pentagon is calling an extended campaign of bombing in Libya, another land that, like Iraq, thanks to our help, has replaced repression that killed some with chaos that has killed unknown thousands. And all we got at the Democratic National Convention was chest thumping about how tough we've been and are being and will be, as the amazing Mr. O looks forward to handing over the reins to someone who's even more of a militarist than he ever was. An age of perpetual warfare is on us, and far too many of us don't seem to care, because Americans aren't the ones doing the dying. All right, speaking of war crimes, that brings us directly to the outrage of the week. A couple of weeks ago, I reported that Chelsea Manning, the war crimes whistleblower, is now in prison for 35 years for espionage for the heinous crime of letting the American public know about the nature of the war we were fighting in Iraq. Chelsea Manning, who survived months of solitary confinement, which is considered torture by UN treaty. Chelsea Manning, who proved herself stronger than the government ever expected, nonetheless had hit a wall and tried to commit suicide. She survived and described herself as well and glad to be alive. And what the government now, with the full knowledge and approval of the amazing Mr. O, what the government has put her through is outrageous enough, but what they propose to do now goes beyond the bounds of even minimal human decency. According to the ACLU, which is representing her, on July 28th, she was informed that she's facing serious new charges based on her attempt to commit suicide. In other words, having brought her to such a moment of despair that she tried to kill herself, the Army is now taking steps to punish her for that very act. These so-called administrative offenses include resisting a group of prison guards called the Forced Cell Move Team, which is pretty odd because she was unconscious when they got to her cell, having prohibited property, specifically the thing she used to try to kill herself, and conduct which threatens, because apparently somehow she was threatening the security of the jail by trying to commit suicide. If she is convicted of these offenses, she could be classified into maximum security. She could have an additional 9 years in medium security added to her offenses, to her sentence rather, or she could even be placed in solitary confinement indefinitely, up to and including her entire 35-year sentence. This is not the first time the Army has tried this. Last year, she was threatened with solitary confinement for possession of LGBTQ reading material and I'm serious about this, a tube of expired toothpaste. They backed off in the face of a public response that included over 100,000 names on a petition. But the bottom line is Chelsea Manning is a transgender woman being faced to serve out her sentence in an all-male prison who has been subjected to long stretches of solitary confinement and denied medical treatment related to what's called her gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria refers to the anxiety and depression that are connected with the stress, the understandable stress of experiencing a conflict between your physical characteristics and your gender identity. And this denial of treatment has continued even after her attempted suicide. Chelsea Manning had a moment where her emotional pain was so great that she couldn't bear. And now the Army wants to punish her for being in such pain. It is indecent, it is unconscionable, and is an outrage. As a footnote to that, I want to make clear something I've said before. I regard Chelsea Manning as a hero, an American hero, who in the best tradition of conscientious whistleblowing, she saw the public being lied to and took steps to let us know what we had a right to know. There is a tradition that at the end of their terms in office, presidents issue pardons. So, Barack Obama, prove yourself to be the lover of peace you claim to be. Prove your commitment to the transparency that you so far falsely have claimed would be a hallmark of your administration. Stand for the justice in which you claim to believe. And pardon Chelsea Manning. Which actually leads us directly to one of our occasional features. This is the Hero Award, given out occasionally as, for someone who just does the right thing on a matter big or small. Our hero this week is Mayor Joseph Curtatone of Somerville, Massachusetts. In this case, it's not for what he did, but actually for what he didn't do. For nearly a year, a banner has hung over Somerville City Hall reading, "Black Lives Matter." But now the police union in Somerville is demanding the banner be taken down and replaced with one carrying the vapid greeting card sentimentality of "All Lives Matter." Demonstrating true command of hyperbole, the union's letter to the mayor accused Black Lives Matter of inciting violence against police, called the banner deeply troubling, inconceivable, and demoralizing, and accused the mayor of standing silent over the seemingly daily protest assassinations of innocent police officers around the country. Just as a quick sidebar here, 33 cops in the United States have been killed by gunfire so far this year. Well over a third of them, perhaps half if not more, were killed by white people. All right, so getting back to our hero, what did Mayor Curtatone not do? Capitulate. My unwavering support for our police officers does not and cannot preempt our commitment to addressing systemic racism in our nation, he said. The banner remains. And Somerville Mayor Joseph Curtatone is a hero. And as a sort of a footnote to that, and since I've also talked about voter ID this week, there's a study from a couple of years ago that makes a point related to that. The study was done in 2014 by the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication. It found that 67% of white Americans support voter ID laws. But if the question was asked accompanied by a photo of a black person using a voting machine, support increased to 73%. A shift that was called modest but statistically significant, which means it represented an actual change. Ask the question together with a photo of a white person using a machine or no image at all, actually made no difference in the level of support. And no, by the way, it did not go both ways. The different images or no image made no difference in the degree of support for voter ID expressed by blacks or Hispanics. Consider that just a reminder and sort of another reason why Joseph Curtatone is a hero. Right, finally, this week, I have talked several times before about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, this so-called free trade deal among 12 Pacific Rim nations, which together account for 40% of the world's economy, making it the biggest trade deal since NAFTA, a deal which is responsible for the loss of millions of high-paying manufacturing jobs in the U.S. in exchange for millions of low-paying service industry jobs in the U.S. I actually call it a so-called free trade deal because it's more like a transnational corporation bill of rights. And the more people know about this thing, the less popular it becomes. Enough so that Bernie Sanders was able to make his long-standing opposition to it a centerpiece of his campaign. And even Hillary Clinton, who once called TPP the gold standard of free trade agreements, has been forced to at least make sounds opposing it. Here's the thing. There's going to be a push to ratify this monster during the lame duck session of Congress after the election. And the thing is, even if that fails, it won't be the end of it. Because there are persistent signs now that Clinton, assuming she wins the presidency, as I expect she will, that she will, after the election is safely behind her, flip-flop again back to supporting the TPP. The signs include the fact that there's no opposition to this deal in the Democratic National Platform, that she chose as a running mate a strong supporter of the TPP, and most recently the statement by Terry McAuliffe, who's the governor of Virginia and a Clinton bestie, that he said that with a couple of changes in this, Clinton will support the TPP. Now, he tried to walk that back, not surprisingly. It was politically unwise to have said that, but doesn't change the fact that there are these increasing numbers of hints out there about what Clinton will do and about how she will act. Put another way, what McAuliffe was saying was that make a few tweaks in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that would become Clinton's justification for going back on her word and returning to her classic position of supporting big business over the working public. And by the way, whatever happened to asking about those speech transcripts? I'll say it again. If you live in a swing state, if you live in a toss-up state, a state where a small number of votes could make the difference, I suppose you'll have to swallow your bile and vote for Hillary Clinton. But you should do it knowing what it is you're going to get and knowing that the fight is by no means over. All right, I'm going to make that it for this week. Next week, I promised myself I'd do it this week, and obviously I failed. So next week, I promised myself I'm going to talk some about global warming, something I've not talked about in a while. News just came out that said that 2015 was the hottest year on record. It actually broke other records about ocean levels and about heat content of the ocean, a whole string of warming records that were broken in 2015 and promise to be broken again in 2016. So I do want to talk about that next week. I've not talked about it in way too long, but for the moment, we're just going to say that that's going to be it for this week. We will see you next week. Stay cool, stay watered, stay warm, whatever it is you need to do where you are. But you just have the best week you possibly can. And until then, peace.